All right, this morning, reading from Esther, the second chapter, verses 16 through 18. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is in the month of Tabith, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than he loved all the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favor and devotion, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet to all his officials and ministers, Esther's banquet. He also granted a holiday to the provinces and gave gifts with royal liberality. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. All right, we just jumped right there into the middle of that story in chapter 2. So as we start out with Esther, I'm going to spend some time today, for those of you who would like a refresher on the story of Esther. We're going to cover the whole story, or probably the highlights of the story real quickly. And just so you know, this story is probably PG-13, because it is. But we don't take it out of the Bible because it's PG-13. We just dismiss the children before we talk about it. So Esther's story is set in a kind of a unique time period in history. So we had the two massive empires that came in and wreaked havoc on the Promised Land and on the people residing in those areas, the Jewish people. So we first had the Assyrians. They came through, they did their thing. Then the Babylonians came through and did their thing. And then the Persians came through and they conquered the Babylonians. And Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia at the time of the conquering, told the Jews that they were free to go back and to live life as they wanted to. But kings become different kings and different kings and different kings, and we get a few generations of kings later, and we get to this king named Ahasuerus. And that is his Hebrew name, but more often in history, he is referred to as King Xerxes. So King Xerxes, it's easier to say, King Xerxes is looking for a new wife. Why he's looking for a new wife, we'll talk about that part of the story next week. But he's looking for a new wife, and somebody comes up with the great idea. One of his advisors says, how about we just rustle up all the best-looking virgin women, and we'll bring them in, and you can pick. And being a king at that time, he was not concerned with the things that would concern us, like, I don't know, sexism and terrible treatment of women. But he says, sounds like a good idea, so let's do this thing. So they go through a months-long process of purification. That means they sit in steam rooms. They are around incense and fragrances that will permeate their pores as a scent of like a permanent kind of perfume. They get cosmetic treatments. They're taught how to conduct themselves in the presence of the king. Anyway, it's these like months of preparation and training. And finally, King Xerxes says, okay, let's let one or a few of them at a time come in and spend the night with me. So he's auditioning these women to be his wife. And any that don't make the cut will just be a permanent part of his harem going forward. But one lucky, if you could call it that, young woman will get to be the next queen. So one of the women who is brought in this group of beautiful virgins is a young Jewish girl, not too young, she's of age, but at that time anyway. She's a Jewish girl, and her name is Esther. And we don't know much about her. We know just a little bit about her background. One is that she was orphaned as a child and has been raised for the most part by her older cousin, whose name is Mordecai. And Mordecai tells Esther, hey, why don't you just keep your Jewish identity a secret? That hasn't always worked well for us. in our history to be out front with that. And since we are living way outside of the Promised Land, we're living in the diaspora. They're in a place called Susa, which is on the eastern edge of the Persian Empire, but it's where the capital of Persia was at the time. And so Mordecai says, so just keep that part of your ancestry a secret, and let's see how this plays out. And even if she didn't want it to go that way, she doesn't really have a choice, because that's the way of the world at that time. So Esther goes, and she gets called in for her night audition, and the next morning she leaves, and the king clearly took a liking to her, because he says, okay, she made the cut. And through the rest of the process, as it plays out, he says, I have chosen my next queen, and it will be the girl Esther. So Esther becomes queen, and we don't hear a whole lot more about how that is going for months or even a few years. Now, her older cousin Mordecai, the one who told her to keep her Jewishness a secret and her relationship to him a secret, he works in the king's palace. Now, he's not one of the higher-ups. He's sort of a lesser-known figure. But one day, he's hanging out near the gates, and some of the eunuchs who are there to protect the king and the queen are talking amongst themselves, and they're whispering about an assassination plot to kill King Xerxes. Well, Mordecai catches wind of this. He mentions it to Esther, and it gets word to the king. And so the king is very grateful that this assassination plot on his life has been foiled. But somehow in the mix of all that, this other guy named Haman, who we hear is an Agagite, Haman the Agagite, he is also working in the king's palace, and he keeps getting promoted up and up and up. Now, Haman, as he passes through the king's court every day, has this custom where he wants everybody who is lower in the pecking order than him to bow to him, to pay respects to him. So please bow when Haman walks by. Now, whether it's because Mordecai refuses to do this on grounds of his faith and he will bow to no man, or whether he's just stubborn and doesn't like Haman, or because Haman is an Agagite and he doesn't like the Agagites, he's not going to bow to him. And when finally Haman catches on that Mordecai is not bowing to him, he is enraged about this. And he goes to the king one day and he says, King Xerxes, I have a request from you. Since you are all-powerful, if I paid you a handsome sum of silver for your treasury, could we do away with this pesky group of people in the empire known as the Jews? They are an unpleasant group of people. They have unnatural kinds of customs. They are peculiar in your sight, and they refuse to assimilate into the culture of the rest of the kingdom. So would it be okay with you if I just used your signet ring and stamped on a document that I wrote that went out to all parts of your empire to say, feel free to dispose of the Jews? And the king says, fine, sounds good to me. So Haman walks out of the king's court that day feeling very proud of himself, chest puffed up. Mordecai doesn't bow to him as usual, and he tells everybody, guess what just happened? I hold in my hand this decree from the king that we are going to dispose of the Jews. And let's do this. Hey, Mordecai, check this out. I've got some dice in my pocket. I'm going to shake them up and roll them in front of you, and whatever number comes out on the die, that is the day that we will annihilate the Jews. Here we go. And he casts the die, and the number 13 comes up. So we know he wasn't using six-sided die. The number 13 comes up. And so it's going to be on the 13th of the month that is when this plan goes into effect. Now, Mordecai knows what's in store now. This is really, really bad news. And so he goes to Esther and he says, you can't be closeted about your Jewish identity anymore. It's time for you to step up and do something. And you are the only person who has the opportunity to do something. I mean, the position that you hold right now, you may be the best chance for, not just for you and for me, but for our people. So you need to do something. She's uneasy about the idea, but she says, okay, tell all of the Jews in Susa to declare a fast for a couple of days. Pray about this and pray for me that I might think of something. She comes up with an idea. She goes to the king and she says, I have a request of you. He says, anything that you want, my lovely queen. What is it that you would like? And she says, I'd like to throw a special feast. Okay, well, who's the feast for? Well, it's for you, my dear. It's for you. And if we could, let's invite your right-hand man, Haman, to come to the feast too. I'd like it to be just the three of us. And at that feast, they're talking, and the king says, by the way, tell me again who it was that came up with this, or told us about this assassination plot. And she says, it was this man, this Jew, Mordecai. Oh, wow. What should we do to honor him? And Haman's thinking that when the king says, we have a special man that we need to honor tonight, Haman's thinking in his puffed up sense of arrogance, it's me that they're talking about. So the king says to Haman, what should we do to honor our special person that we are honoring tonight at our banquet? And he says, well, I think that you should put him in the king's robes, put him on the king's fanciest horse, and parade him throughout the town and make a parade. King says, great idea. And maybe he should get the king's signet ring too. Great idea. He says, at once, Haman, as soon as we're done with the feast, why don't you go get Mordecai and put my best robes on and put my ring on and put on my fancy horse and let's do a parade. Well, this, of course, sickens Haman even more, but he still knows that he's got the upper hand because the day is coming. In fact, he is so excited about this day coming for the assassination of the Jews that he has built a gallows in his front yard where he will watch Mordecai swing from. Well, things turn a little bit on their head in this situation. But the king says, okay, so now we got that out of the way. I've been wanting to honor that person who, uncovered this assassination plot. But why are we really here tonight? And Esther says, well, if it pleases you, can we do this again? Soon? Can we do another banquet? Sure. Okay. So the next day they have another banquet. It's just the three of them again. The king says, okay, now tell me, what is it that you want to do? What is it that is your request at this lovely banquet that has been prepared for the three of us? He says, well, somebody, I have to tell you, has devised a plot to kill me. What? Yes, but not just me, but my people. What are you talking about? I am a Jew. I am a Jewish person. This is my heritage. This is my story. This is my family. And there has been a plot to assassinate, to annihilate, to wipe out our entire population. The king says, who would be responsible for this vile conception of genocide? Him, Haman. What? The king is shocked by this, but he says, well then, surely Haman deserves to die. And so Haman goes and he swings from the gallows that he had constructed in his own front yard, and his sons along with him. And on the 13th day of the month, instead of it being a day of annihilating the Jews, instead now is a celebration. And it's called Purim, even to this day that the Jews celebrate it, because the pur is the name of the die that were cast for that special day to commemorate that. But the story goes even further. And it says that on this day, the Jews then were able to change the decree from not being something that would annihilate or wipe out them, but instead made it open season on any of the enemies of the Jews. And so the Jews were able to, with the king's orders, kill any of their enemies with the king's blessing. The book of Esther is an amazing story. It's told in the style of an epic, right? We have these reversals of fortune. We have underdogs that become heroes. We have unlikely of characters emerging, rags to riches. It's all of that, right? It's also an origin story. It's a story about a woman who saved an empire. It's about a woman who saved a king's life. It's about a woman who went from a sex slave to a queen. It's a woman who, despite the unlikeliest of circumstances, ends up being the one to save her people. And it's also a story that we can't just look at the sugar-coated, gilded version of the story. We got to talk about all the unpleasant stuff about this story. It's wildly sexist. There's things that should make us all very uncomfortable in this story, and we can't just read it as though it was no big deal. And yes, it's one of those things that we say it is a product of its time, and that's not what the people were concerned with when they were first telling this story. And ultimately, it has to be about the ultimate outcome. But then there's also this part of the story that feels like instead of just the Jews being saved, now they turn into the aggressors, and that makes me uncomfortable too. And so it's a complex story. And as I was preparing this story, I was really going to do something more like what Amanda did with the kids. Talk about underdogs, talk about the imperfect nature of the characters in so many of the biblical stories. After all, Esther is one of the most controversial books in the Bible for Jews and for Christians, for lots of different reasons. But historically, the Jewish community has been uneasy at times about the book of Esther because Esther is not a model Jew. She doesn't talk about the covenant. She never worships in the book. She never prays. She never upholds any dietary standards that were distinctive of the Jewish people. So in many ways, she is not exemplary and not likely to be a hero. But that's again another thing that seems to be that God always seems to use not just the underdog, but the imperfect underdog. Moses, the murderer, David, the adulterer, Paul, the persecutor of Christians, the things that Amanda mentioned. Esther, the not model Jew that's Jewish and saves her people. But in light of current events, I think this story also got more complicated in the last 36 hours. At least for me. How do we talk about a story where we see the events of Esther taking place and make sense of it in light of our current situation? And I have to tell you that if I'm a little more emotionally attached to this today, it's because I'm also filled with a lot of gratitude because my wife and son were about 10 hours from entering Israel yesterday and ended up being rerouted, and they're safe in Cyprus right now. But they were about to spend 2 days in Israel. And so I'm just being perfectly honest with you here. I sat down at my desk yesterday, and it was time to revisit the sermon that I had written for today. In this story, we see all of the wonderful things that make this story so fantastic. We see the rags to riches. We see the change, the plot twist, right, happening before our eyes. We see the good guys, or the bad guys, called out after they're initially rewarded, but then get what they deserve, so it seems. We see all of this turnabout kind of stuff that's happening in here. The decree was for one thing, now the decree is for another thing. The die were cast to be the day that would be the extinction of the Jews, and instead it becomes the salvation of the Jews, right? Everything gets flipped on its head. But it's also complicated. Haman, the bad guy in the story, the villain, is an Agagite. The Agagites, we don't know if that was actually a group of people, or if it were people that were sort of ascended from, or descended from rather, or were people that were related in some way as a part of a community that go back to King Agag. King Agag was a king of the Amalekites. The Amalekites were the first group to attack King Saul, the first king of the united monarchy of the Hebrew people. So when Haman and Mordecai have bad blood as an Agagite and a Jew, it's because that at this point, for centuries, these two groups of people have been mortal enemies. Right? It's not just in this story that Mordecai didn't bow down to the man who held a higher position of power in the king's court. He didn't bow down to him as a Jew to an Agagite when the Agagite held the power. You see, it's more complicated than it looks. And the Amalekites are in the land of the Philistines, which is where we get the word Palestine from. And we go back a few centuries, but then we go forward millennia, and you see how complicated it is. Today's conflict between the folks that committed acts of terror and atrocity from Gaza are the Palestinians, and the Jews are the Israelis. Like, you see the connection of the dots through the decades, through the century, through the millennia, and it's just so dang complicated. And I empathize with people who suffer atrocities under terror attacks. And I empathize for innocent people that are going to be killed by the hundreds in the coming weeks on both sides. Because as a Christian, I want to believe that we can find a way of peace moving forward. I want to look to the words of an even older time period, to the book of Isaiah, when Isaiah in the 2nd chapter talks about a time when we will beat swords into plowshares. And we will not learn or teach war anymore, but we will have a day of peace going forward. And I have no idea what to do to make that happen, because it's really complicated, and it goes back way farther than I can imagine. And when people are taught to hate for generations, for hundreds of years, it's really hard to undo that. So where do we find a message of redemption or hope in the book of Esther? We could read it today as a staunch book about nationalism and pride and identity, and at all costs preserving our people. But instead, I want to highlight something different in this story, which is that we continue to worship the God who can turn a seemingly impossible situation on its head and make possible out of impossible. And that's what I want to cling to today. That's what I want to hold on to as a person of faith. That's what I want as a Christian who says, I can empathize with both sides. I can want peace, a lasting, permanent peace for people that seemingly have never been able to find that peaceful solution. And not just a ceasefire, but a laying down of arms and beating them into plowshares forevermore. That's what I am hungry for. That's what Jesus desires for his church, for his world. That's what the kingdom looks like, and we need to be working for that. And I have not the foggiest idea of where to begin with that except for on my knees. And so we pray again today for the God who is able to take the impossible and make it so, to take the way things are and to turn them upside down, the God of surprises, the God of new beginnings, the God of peace, to be our lighthouse and our way forward once again. It's just so complicated. But as a believer, I have faith and I have trust that God is our way forward. Will you pray with me?